The alarm clock rang at 5:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning, but Sarah Johnson was already awake. She had been staring at the ceiling for hours, unable to sleep. Today was the day she had been dreading for the past week. Today they would bury Grandpa, Earl, the man who had built their family farm from nothing over 60 years ago. Sarah rolled out of bed and walked to the window. The Nebraska morning was cold and gray, with thick clouds covering the sky. She looked out at the fields that stretched. As far as she could see, the corn was perfect, ready for harvest. Golden stalks swayed gently in the morning breeze. Earl would have been so proud to see his crop looking this good. In the kitchen, Sarah started making coffee with shaking hands. The house felt empty without Earl's morning routine. Every day for the past 10 years since his wife Mary had died, Earl would wake up at 5 a.m. sharp. He would make his coffee, read his farming magazine, and then walk through every field before breakfast. The old man knew every inch of his land like it was part of his own body. Mike Johnson, Sarah's husband and Earl's only son, came downstairs wearing his black funeral suit. He looked uncomfortable in the formal clothes. Mike was more used to wearing work boots and overalls covered in dirt from the fields. He had learned everything he knew about farming from his father, working side by side with Earl since he was old enough to walk. "I still can't believe he's gone," Mike said quietly, pouring himself a cup of coffee. His hands were rough and calloused from 40 years of farm work, but today they were gentle as he touched the kitchen table that Earl had built with his own hands. Their son Jake came downstairs next. At 17 years old, Jake was tall and strong like his father and grandfather before him. But today he looked young and lost. Earl had been his best friend, teaching him how to drive the tractor, how to read the weather, and how to respect the land that fed their family. "Grandpa always said this farm would stay in our family forever," Jake said, his voice cracking slightly. He was trying hard not to cry, but everyone could see the pain in his eyes. Sarah hugged her son tightly. "It will, honey. Your grandpa made sure of that. This land is ours, and it always will be." What the Johnson family did not know was that 3 months ago, Earl had received some very unwelcome visitors. 2 men in expensive suits had driven up to the farm in a black car that looked out of place on the dusty country road. They represented Meridian Agricultural Corporation, one of the biggest farming companies in America. The men had offered Earl a deal that sounded too good to be true. They wanted to buy his 150 acres for twice what it was worth. They offered him $2 million for land that was only worth $1 million. Most farmers would have jumped at such an offer, but Earl was not most farmers. "This land has been in my family for 60 years, Earl had told the men firmly. "My father worked himself to death to buy this place. I built this farm with my bare hands. My son grew up here, and my grandson is learning to farm here too. This land will stay in my family until the day I die and long after that." The corporate men had not been happy with Earl's answer. They had tried to pressure him, talking about how small family farms were dying out and how he should think about his family's future. But Earl had stood his ground. He had walked them to their car and watched them drive away, never imagining that they would be back. What Earl also did not know was that Meridian Corporation had been planning for his refusal. They had done their research on the Johnson family. They knew that Earl was 78 years old and had been having heart problems. They knew that Mike was completely focused on farming and did not understand legal paperwork. They knew that Sarah was a kind, trusting woman who always saw the best in people. Most importantly, they knew something that even the Johnson family did not know. The land that Earl's father had bought in 1963 was sitting on top of something very valuable. Deep underground, beneath the cornfields and the old oak trees, there were rare earth minerals worth $40 million. Meridian Corporation had done secret tests and surveys. They knew exactly what was buried under the Johnson farm. The corporate executives had made a plan. If Earl would not sell his land willingly, they would take it by force. They had lawyers working on fake documents. They had bribed local officials to look the other way. All they needed was the right moment to strike. That moment came when Earl had his heart attack the previous Tuesday night. He had been walking through his fields one last time before bed, just like he did every evening. Sarah found him the next morning, lying peacefully under his favorite oak tree, The doctor said he had died instantly with no pain. While the Johnson family grieved and planned the funeral, Meridian Corporation put their plan into action. They had been watching the family's every move. They knew what time the funeral was scheduled. They knew that the whole family would be at the cemetery for at least 2 hours. They knew that the closest neighbors were either going to the funeral or were too far away to see what was happening at the farm. On the morning of the funeral, as Sarah, Mike, and Jake got ready to say goodbye to Earl, 3 trucks full of equipment were parked just outside the county line. The drivers were waiting for a phone call that would tell them when to move. They had bulldozers, demolition equipment, and crews of workers who had been paid extra money to work fast and ask no questions. The funeral director, Mr. Peterson, had known Earl for 30 years. He handled the service with great care and respect. The small country church was packed with neighbors, friends, and fellow farmers who had all been touched by Earl's kindness over the years. During the service, people shared stories about Earl. They talked about how he had always been ready to help his neighbors during tough times. They remembered how he had donated food from his farm to the local food bank every harvest season. They spoke about his deep love for the land and his belief that farming was not just a job, but a sacred responsibility to feed others. Pastor Williams gave a beautiful speech about Earl's life. He talked about how Earl had always said that a man's true wealth was not measured in money, but in the health of his soil and the love of his family. The pastor said that Earl had lived a rich life because he had both. As the family listened to these touching words, they had no idea that at that exact moment, their entire world was being destroyed. At 11:47 a.m., while Earl's casket was being lowered into the ground, the first bulldozer rolled onto the Johnson family farm. The timing was not an accident. Meridian Corporation had planned this moment with the precision of a military operation. They knew that the family would be at the cemetery for exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes. They had calculated how long it would take to drive from the farm to the church and back. They had even checked the weather forecast to make sure there would be no delays. As Sarah threw a handful of dirt onto her father-in-law's casket, she whispered a promise. "We'll take good care of your farm, Earl. It will stay in our family forever, just like you wanted." She had no way of knowing that at that very moment Earl's beloved farm was being torn apart by machines that cared nothing for 60 years of memories, hard work, and dreams. At exactly 11:47 a.m., while the pastor was saying the final prayers over Earl Johnson's grave, a massive yellow bulldozer rolled through the front gate of the Johnson family farm. The machine was so big that it crushed the wooden gate posts that Earl had painted white just last spring. The driver, a man named Tony Martinez, had been doing demolition work for 15 years, but he had never felt so uncomfortable about a job. Tony had been told by his boss that this was a routine foreclosure. The family had not paid their bills and the bank was taking back the property. But something felt wrong about the whole situation. The farm looked well maintained and successful. The cornfields were perfect, ready for harvest. The farmhouse was freshly painted. This did not look like the property of people who could not pay their bills, but Tony needed the job. His own family was struggling, and Meridian Corporation was paying him double his usual rate for this job. They had also told him that he needed to work fast and not ask questions, so Tony pushed his doubts aside and started his bulldozer toward the first building on his list. Behind Tony came a convoy of destruction. There were 3 more bulldozers, 2 excavators, a demolition crane, and trucks full of workers. All of the equipment had Meridian Corporation logos on the sides, but the workers had been told to cover them with tarps. The company did not want anyone to know they were responsible for what was about to happen. The demolition supervisor, a hard man named Rick Thompson, stood on a small hill overlooking the farm. He held a tablet computer that showed him detailed plans of every building on the property. Rick had been hired by Meridian Corporation specifically for jobs like this. He was known for being fast, efficient, and willing to do whatever it took to get the job done. Rick spoke into his radio headset, giving orders to his crew. "Start with the outer buildings first. Take down the barn, then the chicken coop, then the equipment shed. Save the house for last. And remember, we need to be done and out of here in 2 hours." The first building to fall was the old red barn that Earl had built in 1965. It was where 3 generations of Johnson men had stored their hay, kept their animals, and fixed their equipment during long winter months. The barn was solid and strong, built to last for decades. But it was no match for a bulldozer driven by a man in a hurry. Tony's machine hit the barn wall with tremendous force. The old wooden boards that Earl had nailed in place with his own hands splintered and cracked. Within minutes, the entire structure collapsed in a cloud of dust and debris. 60 years of family history was reduced to a pile of broken wood in less than 10 minutes. Inside the barn had been Earl's collection of antique farming tools. He had old plows, hand tools, and equipment that his father had used in the 1940s. Earl had always planned to donate these items to the County Historical Society. Now they were all crushed under tons of wood and metal, destroyed forever. Next, the crew moved to the chicken coop where Earl's prize-winning hens had lived. These were not ordinary chickens. Earl had spent years breeding them, and they won blue ribbons at the county fair every year. The hens produced eggs that the family sold to their neighbors, earning a small but steady income that helped pay for Jake's school expenses. The excavator driver, a young man named Carlos, tried not to think about the chickens as he demolished their home. He could see some of them running around in panic, trying to escape the noise and destruction. Carlos had grown up on a farm himself, and he knew how much time and care it took to raise good chickens. But his supervisor was watching, and Carlos needed to keep his job. The equipment shed was next. This building held all of the family's farming machinery. There was the tractor that Earl had bought used in 1987 and had maintained perfectly for over 30 years. There was the combine harvester that Mike had saved for 3 years to buy. There were tools, spare parts, and equipment worth over $100,000. The demolition crew did not try to save any of the equipment. Their orders were clear: destroy everything as quickly as possible. The tractor that had harvested thousands of acres of corn was crushed like a toy. The combine, that had been Mike's pride and joy, was reduced to scrap metal. Tools that had been passed down from father to son were buried under piles of debris. As the crew worked, they made sure to destroy the farm's water well and electrical systems. They cut the power lines and filled the well with dirt and rocks. This was not an accident. Meridian Corporation wanted to make sure that even if the Johnson family somehow got their land back, it would be impossible to farm it again. The vegetable garden where Sarah had grown tomatoes, beans, and corn for her family's table was next. The bulldozer driver ran his machine back and forth through the carefully tended rows, mixing the plants with diesel fuel and motor oil. The garden that had fed the Johnson family for 20 years was turned into a toxic mess in just a few minutes. But the most heartbreaking destruction was yet to come. At 12:15 p.m., Rick Thompson gave the order that everyone had been waiting for. Take down the house. The Johnson family farmhouse was not just a building. It was where Earl had brought his bride Mary in 1960. It was where Mike had been born and had taken his first steps. It was where Jake had grown up, learning about farming and family values. The house held 60 years of birthday parties, Christmas, mornings, family dinners, and quiet evenings on the front porch. The house was solid, built in the 1950s with thick walls and a strong foundation. Earl had maintained it perfectly over the years, adding rooms as his family grew and making improvements with each passing decade. The front door was painted blue because it had been Mary's favorite color. The kitchen windows faced east, so Mary could watch the sunrise while she made breakfast. The biggest bulldozer on the site, operated by Tony Martinez, approached the house slowly. Even Tony, who had demolished hundreds of buildings, felt sick as he prepared to destroy what was obviously a much-loved family home. He could see children's toys in the yard, flowers planted around the front porch, and laundry still hanging on the clothesline. At 12:18 p.m., Tony's bulldozer crashed through the blue front door. The sound of splintering wood and breaking glass echoed across the empty fields. Inside the house, family photos fell from the walls and shattered on the floor. Earl's favorite chair, where he had read his farming magazines every evening, was crushed under tons of metal and debris. The kitchen where Sarah had cooked thousands of meals for her family was demolished in seconds. The dining room table where the family had shared their meals and talked about their days was reduced to splinters. The bedrooms where 3 generations of Johnsons had slept and dreamed were filled with dust and rubble. In the master bedroom, Earl's Purple Heart from the Isai Korean War was buried under pieces of the ceiling. The medal that he had earned for his service to his country was now just another piece of debris to be hauled away. In Jake's room, his collection of farming magazines and his Future Farmers of America awards were destroyed, but perhaps the most cruel destruction happened in the living room. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace had been dozens of family photos spanning 60 years. There were pictures of Earl and Mary's wedding, photos of Mike as a baby, pictures of 3 generations, of Johnson men standing proudly in front of their farm. All of these irreplaceable memories were now scattered and broken among the ruins. As the house collapsed, a cloud of dust rose into the air that could be seen for miles. Mrs. Henderson, the Johnson family's elderly neighbor, was homesick with the flu and had not been able to attend Earl's funeral. When she heard the terrible noise of the destruction, she looked out her bedroom window in shock. Mrs. Henderson could not believe what she was seeing. She had lived next to the Johnson family for 40 years. She had watched Mike grow up and had been like a grandmother to Jake. The sight of their beautiful farm being destroyed filled her with horror and anger. With shaking hands, Mrs. Henderson picked up her smartphone. She was not very good with technology, but her granddaughter had taught her how to record videos. She pointed the phone toward the Johnson farm and began recording everything she could see. Her hands were trembling with rage and disbelief, but she managed to capture clear footage of the bulldozers, the Meridian Corporation logos, and the systematic destruction of her neighbor's life work. As Mrs. Henderson recorded, she noticed something that would later prove to be very important. Standing next to the demolition supervisor was a man in an expensive business suit. The man was not dressed like a construction worker. He was clearly someone important, someone in charge. He was holding what looked like a tablet computer and was pointing at different buildings, giving directions about what to destroy next. Mrs. Henderson had seen this man before. 3 months earlier, she had been working in her garden when she noticed a black car parked in front of the Johnson farm. She had seen this same man in the business suit talking to Earl on the front porch. The conversation had not looked friendly, and Earl had seemed upset after the man left. By 1:30 p.m., the destruction was almost complete. The Johnson family farm that had taken 60 years to build was now nothing but piles of rubble and debris. The cornfields that had been ready for harvest were destroyed. The buildings that had sheltered 3 generations of a farming family were reduced to splinters and dust. But the demolition, the drive back from the cemetery should have been quiet and peaceful. The Johnson family had just said their final goodbye to Earl, and they were each lost in their own thoughts and memories. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, holding a tissue, and thinking about all the wonderful things people had said about her father-in-law during the funeral service. Mike drove slowly, his mind filled with stories about his father and all the lessons Earl had taught him about farming and life. In the back seat, Jake stared out the window at the familiar countryside. He was thinking about the last conversation he had with his grandfather just 2 weeks ago. Earl had been teaching him how to read the weather signs in the clouds and how to know when the corn was perfect for harvest. "This land will be yours someday, boy," Earl had said. "You need to learn everything you can about taking care of it." As they drove along the country road toward home, Mike pointed out different farms to distract himself from his grief. "Look, there's the Peterson place," he said. "Your grandpa helped old Tom Peterson build that new barn last year." Sarah smiled sadly, remembering how Earl was always ready to help his neighbors, no matter how busy he was with his own work. The Johnson farm was located at the top of a small hill, about 3 miles from the church. As they drove up the winding road, they could see their property from almost a mile away. Mike had always loved this view of his family's land. The red barn, the white farmhouse, and the golden cornfield stretching in every direction. It was the most beautiful sight in the world to him. But as their car reached the top of the hill, something was terribly wrong. Mike squinted through the windshield, trying to understand what he was seeing. Where their red barn should have been, there was nothing but an empty space. Where their white farmhouse should have been standing, there was only a pile of broken wood and debris. Sarah saw it at the same time as her husband. At first, her brain could not process what her eyes were seeing. "Mike," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "Mike, where is our house?" Mike slammed on the brakes so hard that the car skidded sideways and came to a stop in the middle of the road. The three family members sat in complete silence for several long seconds, staring in disbelief at the impossible scene in front of them. The farm that they had left just 3 hours ago was completely gone. Jake was the first to speak. His young voice was barely a whisper. "Dad, what happened to our home? Where is everything?" Sarah let out a scream that came from the deepest part of her soul. It was a sound of pure anguish that seemed to echo across the empty fields. She threw open the car door and ran toward what used to be their front yard, not caring that her high heels were sinking into the muddy, torn-up ground. Mike followed his wife, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. He pulled out his cell phone to call for help, but his hands were shaking so badly that he could barely hold the device. His mind was racing, trying to understand how something like this could have happened. Had there been a tornado? An explosion? Some kind of terrible accident? Jake got out of the car slowly, like he was walking in a nightmare. He looked around at the destruction with the wide, confused eyes of a teenager who had never seen anything so horrible in his life. This was the place where he had learned to ride a bicycle, where he had played with his friends, where he had felt safe and loved every single day of his 17 years. Sarah fell to her knees beside a piece of blue wood that was sticking up from the pile of debris. She recognized it immediately. It was all that remained of the front door that Earl had painted Mary's favorite color. Sarah picked up the piece of wood and held it against her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. The scene around them was beyond devastating. The barn where Mike had learned to work on tractors with his father was completely gone. Not a single board remained standing. The chicken coop where Earl's prize-winning hens had lived was flattened. The equipment shed that had housed thousands of dollars worth of farming machinery was reduced to a pile of twisted metal. But the worst destruction was where their house had stood. The Johnson family home, where 3 generations had lived and loved and built their memories, was now nothing but rubble. Sarah could see pieces of their kitchen table mixed in with broken glass and chunks of drywall. She could see fragments of the family photos that had hung on their living room walls. Mike walked through the debris like a man in a trance. He found a bent piece of metal that had once been part of his father's Purple Heart display case. The metal itself was nowhere to be found, probably buried somewhere under tons of broken wood and concrete. Mike had always been proud that his father was a war hero, and seeing the metal's case destroyed felt like losing his father all over again. Jake discovered the remains of his bedroom scattered across what used to be the backyard. His collection of farming magazines was soaked and torn. His Future Farmers of America awards were broken and covered in mud. The bed where he had slept every night of his life was split in half and buried under pieces of the roof. As the family wandered through the wreckage of their lives, neighbors began to arrive. Word had spread quickly through the small farming community that something terrible had happened at the Johnson place. Tom Peterson was the first to arrive, followed by the Martinez family from down the road, and then the Hendersons from the next farm over. Mrs. Henderson, who was still recovering from her flu, had wrapped herself in a heavy coat and insisted that her husband drive her over to see the Johnson family. She had something important to tell them, but first she needed to comfort her neighbors who were clearly in shock. "Oh, Sarah, honey," Mrs. Henderson said, putting her arms around the younger woman. "I am so sorry. I saw the whole thing happen. I recorded it all on my phone." Sheriff Martinez arrived about 20 minutes after the first neighbors. Even though he had been a law enforcement officer for over 30 years, he had never seen destruction this complete and deliberate. As he walked through the debris, taking photographs for his report, he kept shaking his head in disbelief. "This wasn't an accident," Sheriff Martinez told the family. "This was done on purpose. Someone came here with heavy equipment and demolished everything while you were at the funeral." Mike looked at the sheriff with confusion and anger. "But who would do something like this and why? We don't have any enemies. Dad never hurt anyone in his life." Sheriff Martinez pulled out a folder full of legal documents. "I'm afraid I have some information that might explain what happened here. A company called Meridian Corporation has filed paperwork claiming that your father defaulted on a large loan. They say they had the legal right to foreclose on this property." Sarah looked at the sheriff like he was speaking a foreign language. "That's impossible. Earl never borrowed money from anyone. He owned this land free and clear. He was proud of the fact that he didn't owe a penny to any bank. Mike took the documents from Sheriff Martinez and began reading them carefully. The paperwork looked official, with stamps and signatures and legal language that was hard to understand. But Mike could see immediately that something was wrong. "This signature doesn't look right," Mike said, showing the papers to his wife. "It looks like Dad's handwriting, but there are small differences. And look at this date. It says he signed this loan agreement 6 months ago, but I remember that day. Dad and I were fixing the tractor together all afternoon. He never left the farm to go to any bank." Jake looked over his father's shoulder at the documents. Even though he was only 17, he was smart and observant. "Dad, look at this address. It says Grandpa lived on Rural Route 7, but we live on Rural Route 5. Grandpa would never make a mistake like that on an important document." Mrs. Henderson, who had been listening to the conversation, stepped forward with her smartphone in her hand. "I have something that might help you understand what really happened here," she said. "I was homesick today, so I didn't go to Earl's funeral. When I heard all the noise from the bulldozers, I looked out my window and recorded everything." The elderly woman's hands were still shaking as she showed the family the video on her phone. The footage was clear and shocking. It showed bulldozers with Meridian Corporation logos systematically destroying every building on the farm. But most importantly, it showed a man in an expensive business suit standing next to the demolition supervisor, pointing at different buildings and giving directions. Sarah gasped when she saw the man in the suit. "I know him. That's the same man who came to see Earl 3 months ago. Earl was upset for days after that visit. He said the man had tried to pressure him into selling the farm, but Earl had refused." Sheriff Martinez studied the video carefully. "This changes everything. If this man was directing the demolition, then this wasn't just a foreclosure. This was a deliberate, planned attack on your property." Mike felt a surge of anger unlike anything he had ever experienced. "They waited until Dad's funeral. They knew we would all be at the cemetery. They planned this whole thing to happen while we were saying goodbye to him." The sheriff nodded grimly. "I'm going to call in the state police and the FBI. This looks like it could be fraud, conspiracy, and criminal destruction of property. We're talking about felony charges that could send people to prison for decades." As the sun began to set over the destroyed farm, the Johnson family stood together among the ruins of. The next morning, Jake Johnson woke up on his friend Tommy's couch with a terrible headache and the horrible realization that yesterday had not been a nightmare. His family's farm was really gone. They had spent the night at the Peterson house because they had nowhere else to go. All their clothes, their belongings, their entire life had been destroyed in less than 2 hours. Jake's mind kept going back to Mrs. Henderson's video. Even though the footage was shaky because her hands had been trembling with anger, it clearly showed the destruction of his family's farm. But Jake had learned some computer skills in his high school technology class, and he had an idea that might help his family. "Mom, Dad," Jake said when he found his parents drinking coffee in the Petersons' kitchen, "I want to look at Mrs. Henderson's video more carefully. Maybe I can use the computer software at school to make the picture clearer and see details that we missed yesterday." Sarah looked at her son with tired eyes. She had not slept at all during the night, and she looked like she had aged 10 years in one day. "Honey, I don't know if watching that video again is a good idea. It's too painful to see our home being destroyed." But Mike understood what his son was thinking. "Jake might be onto something, Sarah. If we can see the video more clearly, we might find evidence that proves these people committed crimes. Let's go to the school and see what Jake can do." An hour later, Jake sat in front of a computer in his high school's media lab. His technology teacher, Mr. Williams, had agreed to help them enhance the video footage. Mr. Williams had been friends with Earl Johnson and was shocked to hear about what had happened to the family farm. "This is terrible," Mr. Williams said, as he uploaded Mrs. Henderson's video to his computer. "Your grandfather was one of the best men I ever knew. Whoever did this is going to pay for it." Jake worked carefully with the video editing software, zooming in on different parts of the footage and adjusting the brightness and contrast to make the images clearer. After about an hour of work, he made a discovery that sent chills down his spine. Dad, Mom, come look at this, Jake said excitedly. I can see the license plates on some of the trucks. And look at this. I can read the name on the side of one of the bulldozers. It says, Martinez Demolition Company, Omaha, Nebraska. But the most important discovery came when Jake enhanced the part of the video that showed the man in the business suit. By zooming in and sharpening the image, Jake was able to see the man's face clearly for the first time. Sarah gasped when she saw the enhanced image. That's definitely the same man who came to see Earl 3 months ago. I remember his face clearly because Earl was so upset after he left. Earl told me the man had been very rude and had threatened him. Mike studied the enhanced video carefully. Look at what he's holding in his hands. That's not just a tablet computer. It looks like he has blueprints or plans of our farm. See how he's pointing at different buildings and giving directions to the demolition crew? Jake made another important discovery as he continued to work with the video. Dad, look at the timestamp on this footage. Mrs. Henderson's phone automatically recorded the exact time when everything happened. The first bulldozer arrived at 11:47 a.m. and the last building was destroyed at 1:32 p.m. Mr. Williams, who had been watching the enhancement process, suddenly had an idea. Jake, can you email me a copy of this enhanced video? I have a friend who works for the state police. He specializes in investigating computer crimes and document fraud. I think he needs to see this footage right away. That afternoon, Mike decided to take the family to see Tom Bradley, a lawyer in the county seat who specialized in agricultural law. Bradley had handled property disputes for 30 years, and several neighbors had recommended him as someone who would fight hard for farming families. Tom Bradley's office was in an old building on Main Street, filled with law books and files from decades of legal cases. Bradley was a tall, thin man in his 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. When the Johnson family walked into his office, he could immediately see the pain and exhaustion in their faces. I heard about what happened to your farm yesterday, Bradley said gently. I want you to know that I'm going to do everything in my power to help you get justice. But first, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Mike handed Bradley the legal documents that Sheriff Martinez had given them the day before. The lawyer put on his reading glasses and began studying the paperwork carefully. As he read, his expression grew darker and more serious. This is clearly fraudulent, Bradley said after several minutes. I can see at least a dozen legal violations in these documents. The signature doesn't match Earl's handwriting that I have on file from previous legal work. The dates don't make sense. And most importantly, the legal language is wrong. This was not prepared by a real lawyer. Bradley continued his examination of the documents. Look at this loan amount. They claim Earl borrowed $1.2 million, but the paperwork says the money was for agricultural improvements and equipment purchases. Earl's farm was only worth about $1 million total. No legitimate bank would loan more money than the entire property was worth. Sarah felt a surge of hope for the first time since the destruction. So you can prove that these documents are fake? Absolutely, Bradley replied. But proving fraud is just the beginning. We need to understand why Meridian Corporation was willing to commit serious crimes to get your land. There has to be something very valuable about your property that they didn't want you to know about. Bradley picked up his phone and called a friend who worked as a geological surveyor. After a brief conversation, he hung up and looked at the Johnson family with a serious expression. I just spoke to Jim Morrison, a geologist who has done survey work all over this county. He told me something very interesting. About 2 years ago, a company hired him to do mineral surveys on several properties in your area. He wasn't allowed to know which company hired him, but he was paid very well to keep the results confidential. The lawyer continued. Jim said that one of the properties he surveyed showed signs of rare earth mineral deposits that could be worth millions of dollars. He couldn't tell me which specific property it was, but the location he described sounds exactly like your farm. Jake's eyes widened with understanding. So that's why they wanted our land so badly. They knew there was something valuable buried under our cornfields, and they didn't want to pay fair price for it. Bradley nodded. Exactly. If there are rare earth minerals on your property, we could be talking about a deposit worth $40 million or more. That would explain why Meridian Corporation was willing to commit fraud and destroy your farm to get the land. That evening, Mr. Williams called Mike with exciting news. His friend at the state police had reviewed Jake's enhanced video and was very interested in the case. The state police had also discovered that Meridian Corporation was being investigated in 3 other states for similar activities. Detective Sarah Chen from the state police is driving down tomorrow to interview your family, Mr. Williams told Mike. She specializes in corporate fraud cases, and she thinks your situation might be connected to a much larger criminal conspiracy. The next morning, Detective Chen arrived at the Peterson house where the Johnson family was staying. She was a small, intense woman in her 40s who had spent 15 years investigating white-collar crimes. She had brought a team of technicians with her who specialized in analyzing video evidence. Your son did excellent work enhancing this video, Detective Chen told the family. The footage clearly shows premeditated destruction of your property, but more importantly, we've identified the man in the business suit. His name is Richard Blackwood, and he's a vice president at Meridian Corporation. Detective Chen showed the family a photograph of Richard Blackwood from Meridian's corporate website. It was definitely the same man who had visited Earl 3 months earlier and who had been directing the demolition of their farm. We've been investigating Meridian Corporation for over a year, Detective Chen explained. They've been using similar tactics to steal farmland across the Midwest. They target elderly farmers, wait for them to die, and then use forged documents to claim the land. Your family's case is the most blatant example we've seen so far. The detective had more shocking news for the Johnson family. We've discovered that Meridian has stolen land from over 200 farming families in the past 5 years. They have teams of lawyers who specialize in creating fake loan documents, and they've bribed local officials to approve fraudulent foreclosure proceedings. Sarah felt sick to her stomach as she realized the scope of the conspiracy. You mean there are 200 other families who have been through what we're going through? I'm afraid so, Detective Chen replied. But your case is different because we have clear video evidence of the crime in progress. Mrs. Henderson's footage and your son's enhancement work have given us the proof we need to take down this entire operation. Detective Chen explained that the FBI was now involved in the investigation. Federal agents were preparing search warrants for Meridian Corporation's offices in 5 different states. The company's executives, including Richard Blackwood, would soon be arrested on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. 3 weeks after the destruction of their farm, the Johnson family sat in the front row of the federal courthouse in Omaha, Nebraska. Today was the day they had been waiting for, the day that Meridian Corporation and its executives would finally face justice for their crimes. Sarah wore her best black dress, the same one she had worn to Earl's funeral. Mike had bought a new suit for the occasion, and Jake looked older and more serious than his 17 years. The courtroom was packed with reporters, other farming families who had been victimized by Meridian, and supporters from the Johnsons' rural community. Tom Bradley, their lawyer, sat at the prosecution table with a team of federal prosecutors who had been working day and night to build their case against the corporation. Detective Sarah Chen had done her job well. The FBI raids on Meridian Corporation's offices had uncovered thousands of documents that proved the company's criminal activities. They found detailed plans for targeting farming families, forged loan documents, and even emails discussing how to time their attacks for maximum emotional damage. The most shocking discovery had been a company memo from CEO Marcus Whitfield that was titled Operation Harvest. The memo outlined Meridian's strategy for stealing farmland across the Midwest. It included a list of over 300 farming families that the company planned to target, with detailed information about each family's financial situation, health problems, and vulnerabilities. Earl Johnson's name had been number 47 on the list. Next to his name, someone had written, "Heart problems, target after death." The memo proved that Meridian had been planning to steal the Johnson farm for over 2 years, just waiting for the right moment to strike. Judge Patricia Williams, a stern woman in her 60s who had grown up on a farm herself, called the courtroom to order. She had been following the case closely and was clearly angry about what Meridian Corporation had done to innocent farming families. "This is one of the most disturbing cases of corporate fraud I have seen in my 30 years on the bench," Judge Williams said as she looked directly at the Meridian executive sitting at the defense table. The systematic targeting of grieving families represents a level of cruelty that is almost impossible to understand. The prosecution's case was devastating. They presented Mrs. Henderson's enhanced video footage, which clearly showed Richard Blackwood directing the destruction of the Johnson farm. They presented the forged loan documents which handwriting experts had proven were fake. Most importantly, they presented evidence that Meridian Corporation had committed similar crimes against 247 farming families across 5 states. Tom Bradley stood up to address the court during his closing argument. Your Honor, this case is about more than just one family's farm. This is about protecting the foundation of American agriculture, the family farmers who feed our nation. Earl Johnson worked for 60 years to build something that could be passed down to his children and grandchildren. Meridian Corporation destroyed that legacy in less than 2 hours, just to steal land they knew contained valuable minerals. The lawyer continued. The Johnson family trusted the legal system to protect their property rights. They trusted that their neighbors would respect their grief during their time of mourning. Meridian Corporation violated that trust in the most brutal way possible. They turned Earl Johnson's funeral into an opportunity to commit crimes. When Richard Blackwood took the witness stand to testify in his own defense, his arrogance shocked everyone in the courtroom. Instead of showing remorse for what his company had done, he tried to justify their actions by claiming that small family farms were inefficient and that large corporations could use the land more productively. The Johnson farm was only producing corn and soybeans, Blackwood said coldly. Meridian Corporation could have used that land to feed thousands more people through modern agricultural techniques. Sometimes progress requires difficult decisions. Jake Johnson felt his anger building as he listened to Blackwood's testimony. This was the man who had destroyed his grandfather's life work, who had crushed his family's dreams, who had turned their day of mourning into a nightmare. When the prosecutor asked Jake to testify about what the farm had meant to his family, the teenager spoke with a maturity that impressed everyone in the courtroom. Mr. Blackwood talks about efficiency and progress, Jake said, looking directly at the Meridian executive. But he doesn't understand what a family farm really is. It's not just about producing crops. It's about 3 generations of my family working together, learning from each other and taking care of the land that takes care of us. My grandfather didn't just grow corn, he grew a family, he grew a community, he grew values that can't be measured in dollars and cents. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. The foreman, a middle-aged man who had grown up on a farm in Iowa, stood up and read the decision that would change everything. We find Meridian Corporation guilty on all 47 counts of fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and criminal destruction of property. We find CEO Marcus Whitfield guilty on all charges. We find Vice President Richard Blackwood guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the farming families who had been waiting years for justice. Sarah Johnson broke down in tears, finally allowing herself to feel the relief she had been holding back for weeks. Mike put his arm around his son, thinking about how proud Earl would have been to see his family fight back and win. Judge Williams sentenced Marcus Whitfield to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Richard Blackwood received 20 years for his role in directing the destruction of the Johnson farm and dozens of other properties. 6 other Meridian executives received sentences ranging from 10 to 18 years. But the criminal convictions were only part of the justice that the Johnson family received. The civil lawsuit against Meridian Corporation resulted in the largest agricultural fraud settlement in American history. The company was ordered to pay $340 million in damages to all the farming families they had victimized. For the Johnson family specifically, the settlement was life-changing beyond their wildest dreams. They received $45 million in compensation, enough money to rebuild their farm and secure their family's future for generations. But even more importantly, they had exposed a criminal conspiracy that had destroyed hundreds of innocent families. The geological surveys that were conducted after Meridian's conviction revealed the true value of the Johnson farm. The rare earth, mineral deposits under their land were worth an estimated $80 million, even more than anyone had originally thought. The minerals included lithium, cobalt, and other elements that were essential for making batteries for electric cars and renewable energy systems. With their settlement money, the Johnson family bought back their original land from the government, which had seized it from Meridian during the investigation. They hired the best architects and builders in the state to design a new farmhouse that honored Earl's memory while incorporating modern sustainable farming technologies. The new house included a special room dedicated to Earl Johnson's legacy. The walls were covered with photos of 3 generations of Johnson farmers, along with Earl's Purple Heart that had been recovered from the rubble. In the center of the room stood a glass case containing the piece of blue wood that Sarah had found in the debris, the last remaining piece of the front door that Earl had painted with such love and care. Jake Johnson decided to study agricultural law in college, inspired by his family's fight for justice. He wanted to help other farming families protect themselves from corporate predators like Meridian Corporation. Sarah started a non-profit organization called the Earl Johnson Foundation, which provided legal assistance to small farmers facing threats from large corporations. Mike continued to work the land, but now with the best equipment money could buy, and farming techniques that would have amazed his father. The Johnson farm became a model for sustainable agriculture, producing not just corn and soybeans, but also serving as a research center for developing new ways to protect family farms. The story of the Johnson family's victory became an inspiration to farming communities across America. It proved that ordinary people could fight back against powerful corporations and win. It showed that justice was still possible, even when the odds seemed impossible. Most importantly, Earl Johnson's dream had survived even the most brutal attack. The family farm that he had sworn would stay in his family forever was not only restored but was stronger than ever before. The old farmer's legacy lived on in the rich soil that continued to feed his community, in the values he had passed down to his son and grandson, and in the courage his family had shown when they refused to give up. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the sun was setting over the fields, Mike and Jake would sit on the front porch of their new house and remember the man who had started it all. Earl Johnson had taught them that good land, hard work, and strong family bonds were worth fighting for. In the end, his lessons had proven to be more valuable than all the minerals buried beneath their feet.